This is Duke University.
So good afternoon, and again, this is Melakaya Cohen, Chair of the Council for European Studies, and it's a pleasure to open the final panel on religious freedom and minority rights in Canadian and U.S. Foreign policy. As I mentioned in my introduction this morning, reasonable accommodations have been for us from the beginning a global issue. What we earlier attempted to do is to learn from non-European and non-American models, non-North American models for the future of the European nation states, but we cannot ignore that throughout the late modern era, both European countries and North American countries have been especially powerful, having advanced their own global agenda of reasonable accommodations. Hence, the panel on religious freedom and minority rights in Canadian and U.S. Foreign policy. And we have with us two eminent political figures to lead our panel on religious freedom and minority rights in Canadian and U.S. foreign policy. But before I turn to them, let me tell you that we have a congratulatory note from Lori Patton, the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Duke and Durden Professor of Religion. And she asked me especially to read this note, which says how sorry she is that she's not able to be with us today. Colleagues, I wish I could be with you today for a conference on such an important topic. The questions of civic life and protected religious practices is at the core of so many of our concerns today, particularly about religion in the public sphere. And the comparisons between Europe and North America are even more compelling, involving the history of church and state in each case. As we consider the evolving legal and cultural landscapes, we also must pay attention to what is defined as proper religion and what is defined as appropriate in the public sphere. And both of these definitions expand and contract with each case that is adjudicated, whether legally or culturally. In certain situations, we have what Habermas in 2006 called the wild sphere, where the possibilities for civic life and civil discourse become ever more fragile. Congratulations on taking these major issues into consideration. At Duke, we are concerned about religion and public life in its many manifestations, and our hope is that this conference can contribute to the broader discourse, which is so essential in this time. Thank you for your contributions. So, Lori Patton, Dean of Arts and Sciences. And now to our presenters today, Dr. Katrina Lantos Swett, Chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and Andrew Bennett, Canadian Ambassador for Religious Freedom. They will talk about the roles as advocates for religious freedom in a world torn by sectarian strife and violence. Dr. Bennett, who will speak first, is Canadian Ambassador for Religious Freedom. He's a volunteer dean and a professor of the history of Christianity at Augustine College in Ottawa. He's also a subdeacon and cantor at the Holy Cross Eastern Catholic Chaplaincy and St. John the Baptist Ukrainian Catholic Shrine, both in Ottawa. And as a cantor in a Jewish synagogue, I especially welcome you to give the presentation.
Very good. Well, I thank you very much for the introduction, and I also happen to be an alumnus of McGill University, so I indirectly complete the McGill troika here this evening. And you may be thinking, do all Canadians either attend McGill University or end up at McGill University at some point? And I would say, well, yes, the wise ones who hope to become wiser certainly do so. So my talk today, as Professor Hakon indicated, is on religious freedom from the perspective of Canadian foreign policy. But before I begin, given the past presentations we've had, I feel that it's important to make an initial distinction. The Office of Religious Freedom, of which I am the ambassador, is housed within Canada's Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, emphasis on the foreign. So I'm here as a representative and an officer of the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, not as an academic, although I have that other hat. So I would ask you to bear that in mind, given my comments. So just like the State Department here in the United States, Canada's Department of Foreign Affairs is solely responsible for foreign policy and does not comment on domestic matters. As such, my mandate as ambassador is not to advocate with respect to domestic religious freedom matters. However, as I think my remarks will hopefully indicate, the fact that we are advancing religious freedom as part of Canada's foreign policy is reflective of the importance of religious freedom in Canada. With that said, as a plural, open, and free democracy, Canada's experience with and perspectives on religious freedom significantly and directly inform our foreign policy and impact our work to protect and defend religious freedom globally. As we witness in the news today, whether in Iraq or Pakistan or Ukraine, some of you might be surprised that I include Ukraine, but I'm happy to discuss that later. Religious freedom is an issue that I think is of growing global significance. We only need to watch the news for that. The violence that we see reflected touches all faith communities, and the Office of Religious Freedom speaks out on behalf of all of those facing persecution, including those who are being persecuted because they choose not to ascribe to a particular religious faith. At the same time as this trend towards increasing global persecution is continuing to advance, we're also witnessing an increase in the percentage of the population in North America who does not identify with any religion or religious denomination, as was indicated earlier this morning. As reported by the Pew Forum, here in the United States, 20% of the population and 33% of those under 30 identify as religiously unaffiliated. In Canada, the religiously unaffiliated figure is even higher nationally at roughly 25%. And these are the highest percentages ever seen in Pew polling. This phenomenon has been called the rise of the nuns. N-O-N-E-S. The irreligious statistical reality in North America means that our office often faces an uphill battle when trying to explain the increasingly religious world abroad to decreasingly religious audiences at home, and also why are you focused on religious freedom as an element of foreign policy. Even cold, hard stats on religious persecution can face skepticism. Foremost among them, the office in countless studies recognize that Christians in particular are the most persecuted faith group in the world. Again, as reported by Pew, Christians have suffered harassment by the state and/or society in 133 countries, 2/3 of the world's nation-states, and suffer in more places than any other religious group. This is a fact that is often not recognized. And in my view, even as we speak out against the persecution of all faiths, and we have done so, we should not be tentative in speaking out about Christian persecution as if it's politically incorrect to do so. Moreover, we are seeing this persecution in numerous and diverse contexts around the world. The growing international problem that we see explains why, on February 19th of last year, the Government of Canada created the Office of Religious Freedom. When we speak about and defend religious freedom, and this is a very important point, we are not engaging in a theological proposition or debate. No, the advancement and defense of religious freedom is about fundamental human rights. And I would, and I do, drill down below that to talk about it as being a manifestation of the need to defend human dignity. With these concepts in mind, the work of the Office of Religious Freedom is focused on 4 principal goals: protecting and advocating on behalf of religious communities under threat around the world, opposing religious hatred, engaging in open and frank discussion, often very frank discussion, I'm happy to tell you some stories afterwards, with foreign governments and civil society on religious persecution, and fourthly, promoting the ability of religious communities to manifest their faith and contribute to society openly and in a free and secure environment. More importantly, the goals of the Office of Religious Freedom reflect the principles of democracy, freedom, human rights, and the rule of law, which underpin Canada's foreign policy engagement and reflect the underpinnings of Canadian society as a whole, I would argue. I think it's important that we recognize these as fundamental principles. Too often when we speak about rights and freedoms, we use the discourse of values. And this might seem a semantic debate, but I think that values can often change with the times, and they can be altered depending on one's perspective, and especially depending on the perspective of whatever country or society you live in. Fundamental principles, such as the ones I just enumerated, by contrast, I think we can argue, are immutable. They are not relative. or subject to the needs of the day. They are not culturally specific, and therefore not the sole preserve of Western liberal democracies. These fundamental principles of human rights, and by extension, the defense of human dignity, democracy, the rule of law, speak to a universal truth that has at its core what I would argue is the foundation of human rights, and as I said, that would be human dignity. And it's upon these principles and freedoms that we have built our country in Canada. With this in mind, I think it's useful to understand the foundations of religious freedom in Canada, which informs our efforts to promote religious freedom in the world today. And one of the advantages of coming later on in the day is that I was able to basically cut out roughly half of my speech because my colleagues did such an eminent job in giving you some of the historical background and the legal historical background. But I'll just maybe draw a couple of salient points out for you to reinforce them. As in the United States, freedom of religion in Canada is a constitutionally protected right, as we've heard. This allows believers the freedom to assemble and worship without limitation or interference, subject, of course, to various other freedoms, and obviously if you're promoting hate speech or engaging in violent acts, that freedom of religion, of course, is not an absolute freedom. Today, this freedom is grounded in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which forms the first part of the Constitution Act of 1982. In Canada, we often just refer to it as the Charter, as you've heard. Well before the Charter, in 1955, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that all religions have equal rights based upon tradition and on the rule of law. At that time, no statutes really formed the basis for this argument. We can go further back. Before the Supreme Court of Canada existed as the final court of appeal, in 1874, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, which has this wonderful kind of noble title, some might say Orwellian, which was the court of last resort for the Dominion of Canada within the British Empire, ruled that the civil courts of Canada had the jurisdiction to resolve disputes between members of a church and the church organization. That nation of Canada, barely 7 years after our Confederation in 1867, was confronted with what was then a contemporary and serious issue of religious freedom, whether church officials in the parish of Montreal could refuse to bury a deceased member of the church because of his political beliefs. In making his ruling for the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, Lord Fillmore held that, and I quote, "The members of the church are entitled to have the church administered according to the church's own internal laws and rules." And so this decision serves as Canada's first major acknowledgement of a freedom of religion existing in Canada in a sort of constitutional legal context. It's upon the foundation that we have in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which does, in the preamble to the Charter, reflect that Canada is founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law, that Canada has sought to enforce rights and freedoms for all its citizens. I think it's important, though, to note that this portion of the preamble has not been accorded legal effect in Charter jurisprudence. When drafting the Charter, Canadian legislators clearly placed significant emphasis on the freedom of religion. And we already heard that freedom of religion or conscience is the first of the fundamental freedoms that are enumerated in Section 2 of the Charter, with freedom of conscience and religion being Section 2A. After this, the Charter articulates the other fundamental freedoms which necessarily link to religious freedom and religious freedom to them. So these are the classic fundamental freedoms: freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including freedom of the press, freedom of peaceful assembly, and freedom of association. So I think, as you can see, the promotion of religious freedom from the Canadian perspective relates directly to our constitutional framework, and it holds a primary place within the Charter and corresponds directly to other fundamental freedoms that we advance as part of our foreign policy. So again, I'm giving you this framework so that you can see how we locate our foreign policy within the Canadian experience, not only the lived experience of Canadians, but also the constitutional legal framework. The strength of the Charter's fundamental freedoms does not mean that the freedom of religion in Canada has gone uncontested. The Charter, both as a binding constitutional document and as the articulation of rights and freedoms, has also been used as the basis for legal challenge many times in our courts, as was referred to earlier. This process of mounting constitutional challenges against nearly every section of the Charter has reinforced the strength of our fundamental freedoms in Canada. In turn, this domestic review process has supported the ability of our government to promote, protect, and defend the freedom of religion as a central part of our foreign policy globally. Showing both interpretive flexibility and constitutional stability, Canadian legal opinions, I think we can argue, on the Charter are grounded in the living tree doctrine of constitutional interpretation. This doctrine says that a constitution is organic and must be read in a broad and progressive manner so as to adapt it to the changing times. A few notable case examples highlight this particular strength, and as already discussed by Professor Van Praag. So religious freedom is very much evolving and advancing within Canada under the constitutional doctrine of this living tree. Canadian case law is full of numerous examples of the ability to interpret our freedoms in a way that adapts with new challenges while preserving our nation's fundamental principles. Again, Professor Taylor highlighted this in terms of his work on the Bouchard-Taylor Commission. Unlike many nations that we engage when we speak about religious freedom in the world, Canada provides a sound, reasoned, and stable example of how the rule of law can serve the cause of peace and stability and reflect the importance of fundamental freedoms such as freedom of religion. Appreciating the domestic Canadian experience with freedom of religion, we can explore how this knowledge informs Canadian foreign policy today. At its core, our belief in the importance of protecting and defending religious freedom is grounded in our Canadian experience, but also in support for Article 18 of the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, which states, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief. That is the acid test, in my view, of a country if it has religious freedom. And freedom either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. And I think this can be extended to say also that it's the freedom to choose not to have a particular religious belief. In understanding the universality of religious freedom from the international human rights perspective, we uncover its linkages to human dignity, which, as I referenced earlier, is a key concept in how we understand religious freedom in Canada. And I'd be a very bad Catholic if I didn't keep a copy of Dignitatis Humanae from the Second Vatican Council in my side pocket at regular intervals such as today. Dignitatis Humanae, document of the Second Vatican Council on religious freedom, explains this concept of religious freedom being linked to human dignity in this way, and I'm quoting sort of at length. Religious freedom means that all, and it's not gender-neutral language, religious freedom means that all men are to be immune from coercion on the part of individuals or of social groups and of any human power, in such wise that no one is to be forced to act in a manner contrary to his own beliefs, whether privately or publicly, whether alone or in association with others, within due limits. It is in accordance with their dignity as persons, that is, beings endowed with reason and free will, and therefore privileged to bear personal responsibility, that all men should be at once impelled by nature and also bound by a moral obligation to seek the truth, especially religious truth. Truth, however, is to be sought after in a manner proper to the dignity of the human person and his social nature. The inquiry is to be free, carried on with the aid of teaching or instruction, communication and dialogue, in the course of which men explain to one another the truth they have discovered or think they have discovered, in order thus to assist one another in the quest for truth. In our work to promote religious freedom and to advocate on behalf of persecuted religious communities, we have spread the message of human dignity as central to the Canadian understanding of freedom of religion. This really speaks to human beings' innate desire to consider and come to know, who am I? Who am I in relationship to others? Who am I in relationship to the world in which I live? And who am I in relationship to God or to a particular philosophy or worldview to which I choose to adhere? Understanding the relationship between religious freedom and human dignity also reveals important connections to the fundamental principle of justice. This relationship is explored in part by Charles Taylor, who links the concept of human dignity to notions of equality in his 1994 essay on multiculturalism and the politics of recognition, in which Professor Taylor states, with the move from honor in traditional societies to dignity in modern societies has come a politics of universalism, emphasizing the equal dignity of all citizens, and the content of this politics has been the equalization of rights and entitlements. What is to be avoided at all costs is the existence of first-class and second-class citizens. It is Professor Taylor's latter point which we confront in so many nations that struggle with freedom of religion today, where majority religions often brutally suppress minority religious communities, or where governments oppress practitioners of all religions through severe constitutional or other legal limitations. What is missing in so many countries today, where you have violations, often egregious violations of religious freedom, is the fundamental principle of equality. On this point, Professor Taylor situates the notion of equal dignity within a society characterized by diversity and difference, such as seen in our modern multicultural Western democracies. And again, quoting Professor Taylor, everyone should be recognized for his or her unique identity. But recognition here means something else. With the politics of equal dignity, what is established is meant to be universally the same, an identical basket of rights and immunities. Whereas with the politics of difference, what we are asked to identify is the unique identity of this individual or group, their distinctiveness from everyone else. Within the religious freedom and justice paradigm, we can expand on this notion of equal dignity within a diverse society to see linkages between religious freedom and the protection of peace and order. When we survey the global landscape today, we see that nearly everywhere that the freedom of religion is violated, John Locke, who wrote about the pernicious seeds of discord and war that come with an abuse of religious freedom, often follow, provoked by, as he states, endless hatreds and slaughters that continue to plague humankind. It's in this challenging realm where politics and religion are often heavily mixed that the Office of Religious Freedom must carefully, on our tiptoes, navigate. And it is why, when advocating for the protection and defense of persecuted religious communities, we rely on universal legal documents such as the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. We recognize also, however, that the legal and intellectual foundations for religious freedom extend much further back than the 1948 Universal Declaration. And we can point to a number of interesting examples, even as far back as the Hammurabi Code, the 3rd century BC, and the Edicts of Ashoka in the Buddhist kingdom in India. But another important example arises in 626 AD, when the prophet Muhammad wrote a letter to his followers concerning the Christian monastery of St. Catherine in Sinai, exhorting them to protect Christians living under Islamic rule, to safeguard their freedom of worship and movement, their freedom to appoint judges and to own property, their exemption from military service and taxes, and their right to protection in times of war. These points of reference, I think, help promote an understanding of the universality of religious freedom beyond the Western tradition. And I think it helps to inform a policy that emphasizes religious freedom not only as a part of a discourse on liberalism and rights, but as part of a universal human experience, again, centered on human dignity, that is inclusive of traditions outside of the West as well. To conclude, as stable and prosperous democracies, our nations bear significant responsibility to share our, let's call them best practices, a term I hate, but others seem to like. It obviously came back in after my edits. I firmly believe that our freedom of religion, particularly as practiced in Canada, where I was born and raised, is of the utmost importance to share with other nations. And it's not some sort of, dare I say, evangelical or proselytizing type of thing. As I said, I think we are speaking to principles that are universally applicable. Underpinned by our charter, the freedom of religion forms one of the central pillars of core strength for nations such as Canada and the United States. Canada's reputation as a tolerant, pluralist, and multicultural society is predicated on a fundamental respect for others' beliefs. This respect does not waver with the changing of the political guard. It is entrenched as part of our constitutional tradition, evolving as that living tree. If there's any hope for other nations struggling with severe persecution and systemic repression, whether that be Pakistan or China or Nigeria, these nations must begin to respect the other in the same way, even in the face of those enemies of religious freedom who might attempt to silence them for doing so. And I'm well aware that taking these steps towards greater religious freedom to be the light in the darkness will require bravery and great risk for the many political, religious, and community leaders living under threat today that we seek to give a voice to, along with our allies, I may say. While we witness horrific bloodshed and religious strife around the world today, it's easy to lose hope and to feel that the battle has already been lost for so many hundreds of millions who will never know genuine religious freedom. But as Canada and as the United States, committed to the advancement of human rights and fundamental freedoms, we simply cannot accept this proposition or allow the current situation to continue. Through our advocacy, policy, and programming work, the Office is working to advance religious freedom around the world as a fundamental principle of progress for all humanity and as a reflection of Canadian society. And I think it really is important for me to say that I hope we're not naive. We recognize that the change that we speak about, where there can be greater religious freedom in certain countries, will require, in many cases, multi-generational shifts to take place. But with our allies in the United States and in other like-minded countries, I think we need to make that start, and also to recognize that we're not the first along this path, that there are many others that have linked the experience that they've had of fundamental freedoms and sought to advance religious freedom. And let me just conclude by what I should have said at the beginning, and that is, it is yet again a wonderful privilege to sit next to Katrina. We've shared podia and forums throughout the last year and a half, and Katrina, you're such a wonderful, positive, zealous champion of religious freedom, and it's a blessing to be next to you again.
Thank you.
So thank you very much.
You just stole my introduction.
And why don't we skip it? Why don't we skip the introduction, because time is so short, and...
I will make it very short.
Okay.
I'll make it very short. But Dr. Katrina Lantos, chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice. She also teaches human rights and American foreign policy at Tufts University, and she has worked on Capitol Hill in a number of very prominent roles, and has been serving on a number of important NGOs and college boards.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I am so delighted to be here today, and I want to start out by thanking Jane and Malachi for convening this wonderful gathering, and I always love the chance to appear with Andrew. I usually embarrass him horribly by talking about how he's the best-looking single guy in the Canadian Foreign Service and all sorts of other things, but we have a lot of fun together, and we're both very passionate about this issue. Before I get into my remarks, I'd like to ask, because I'm curious, how many of you are undergraduate students? Are any of you undergraduates here today? Okay, so no undergrads. How many of you are graduate students? Okay, so the bulk of you are graduate students. I have a lot to say, and I don't have very much time, so I will probably do a little hop, skipping, and jumping through my remarks, because I would like to leave some time for discussion. I found the remarks of the previous presenters to be just fascinating as well. So what I'd like to do is throw out a few just points that you can sort of tuck away maybe for further discussion in the Q&A part. And then I do have more prepared remarks about who we are at USERF and what we do, and I'll try to zip through those quickly. You know, it might make sense to do that just because I feel like there's a lot of intellectual firepower, not just on this side of the table, and that those of us who are here sort of in a presenting capacity would enjoy a chance for dialogue. So maybe I won't do too much of my formal presentation and instead throw out maybe some questions that we can think about. When we talk about the protection of religious freedom as a fundamental human right, and I personally think it's the wellspring right from which most of our most deeply cherished civil liberties spring, you know, freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of the press. So many of them really find their source in what we can broadly describe as freedom of religion, conscience, and belief. And in thinking about this idea of accommodation, not in the specifically Canadian sense of the word or the U.S. disability rights sense of the word, but just what does it mean, you know, to accommodate the religious convictions of others. I like the formulation, which is simple, but sometimes these broad, simple formulations are surprisingly helpful in being applied in a case-by-case basis. So I really like the formulation that government must not forbid people to do that which their faith commands, nor compel them to do that which their faith forbids. And it's big, it's comprehensive, but I think there is in that little couplet, if you will, or formulation, something of a helpful guide for us as we try to find our way through the incredibly diverse thicket of issues that on an ongoing basis will have and will continue to present themselves. A second point that I'd like to make, and Andrew quoted Article 18 of the Universal Declaration and referenced the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and that is the basis on which the commission that I serve on does its work. So we do not base our advocacy for religious freedom internationally on the First Amendment, on American tradition, but on this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I think that it's wonderful for me to contemplate, but we don't see it very much to be the reality in practice. But the Universal Declaration's definition of religious freedom, which I think you read, is broad, it is robust, it is capacious, it is not narrow, it is not constrained, it is not limiting. And again, Andrew referenced some of this, but it makes it very clear that freedom of religion is much more than freedom of worship. We think of freedom of worship as being something more or less confined to the four walls of wherever it is you choose to worship. But Article 18 refers to freedom to teach and to practice publicly and privately, individually and collectively. It references the right to join a faith, to leave a faith, and it extends the right of all these protections to the rights of conscience and not exclusively to the rights of religion. So, for example, at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, we try to be, and I hope we are, as aggressive and as robust in advocating for the rights of agnostics and atheists in societies where they are persecuted for blogging about their convictions, as we are in advocating for the right of persecuted Christian minorities or the Rohingya Muslims or the Baha'is or whoever else it is you might be, thinking about. And I think that that's a really important point. Another thing that I'd like to bring up is that these protections, this basic protection for the fundamental right of freedom of religion, conscience, and belief, is a very good thing for societies. And it's this is in many ways a golden time to be working on religious freedom issues, because now the social science evidence is starting to come in, and it is compelling and really inarguable. Those societies that do a good job providing strong protections for these fundamental human rights, including freedom of religion, have a whole range of other positive desiderata associated with the way they function. So we see that countries that do a good job in protecting this right also have higher standards of living. Very importantly to me, women have higher status in societies that do a good job protecting religious freedom. And sometimes when I tell that to people, they are surprised because there is almost a word association tendency that people have when you say religion. The word association is bad for women. And I think that, again, we're not talking about protecting religion, but protecting religious freedom in that broad and capacious understanding of the word. But the reality is that it is societies that repress and restrict religious freedom where we see women's circumstances also being the most constrained. They tend to be more stable. They tend to be more peaceful. And the converse is true, that societies that are plagued by gross and egregious violations of religious freedom tend to breed extremism, violence, social discord. They do less well economically on a whole range of economic indicators. And a point that I'm often making to people in my government, particularly in our executive branch, when I go to talk to people at the White House or at the State Department, but particularly in the executive branches, guess what? Religious freedom is deeply implicated in our national security. And all you really need to do is take an overlay of the countries that we, in our annual report at USERF, identify as our CPCs, or countries of particular concern, and those are the countries that we consider to be the worst of the worst in terms of offenders. Lay it over a list of the countries from which our gravest national threats derive right now, and they match up to a shocking degree. And so just in the same way that, I think, was it Tom Friedman used to make the argument that, democracies don't attack other democracies and that democracy is good for a more peaceful world. I would suggest that societies that protect religious freedom are less likely to become national security threats to other societies because they are not going to become the breeding grounds for the kind of extremism, terrorism, violence, and disruption that we have seen. Now, another thought that I would just like to throw out there again for sort of our further discussion is that there will be in every society, and we've seen from the erudite presentations of our earlier speakers today that even in countries like Canada and the United States that are clearly leaders in terms of creating societies where we do a pretty darn good job at protecting religious freedom, frictions will arise, conflicts will arise. There are points of contention that are unavoidable. And one of the things that is so interesting about working in the field of religious freedom is how you navigate between these earthly laws and these heavenly laws. It is interesting to me because the world of faith and belief and, linked, as you suggest, to the dignity and the, private conscience sovereignty of the individual is sort of the toughest place for the state, especially for any sorts of authoritarian states, because it is in that zone that the individual member of a society is most liberated from whatever is the prevailing doctrine of the community in which they live. It's when we enter that world of conscience and belief and faith that we are quite consciously saying, I choose now to go to a place that's where, the demands of this exceed the demands of the state. They trump them. And so in that sense, these frictions are particularly interesting, particularly tricky to navigate, and when not navigated as well, they lead to particularly violent and difficult results. And that's why, again, I think as we look to resolve in my country, well, I am in my country now, I'm confused because I've been traveling for the last 2+ weeks. I was first in Norway, then in Berlin, and then in Australia, so forgive me if I refer to you as blokes or say good eye mate, but I've got the Aussie vibe going right now. But in the United States, where we obviously are going to be grappling and wrestling with some of these places where the earthly laws and the heavenly laws are seeming to butt up against one another. I hope that we will bear in mind as we walk through those difficult thickets that we will not necessarily, or one side won't necessarily win by crushing the other. And that the way to create sort of that civic space I talked about in my question to Professor Young, that healthy civic space is not by having one perspective on these emerging social controversies prevail so that we can go around and say, yep, everybody now agrees to abandon their old, and outmoded notions of thinking about this and to sort of come into the fellowship of the new, broader conception of things. That may not be successful, and trying to achieve that sort of all-out, triumphalist victory may not be the way to getting to where we really want to get as a society. I'll just throw this out because I thought it was a good image, but as I said, when you move to that realm of conscience and belief, you are going to a space where the state should not have much of a role, where it really shouldn't be able to intrude too much. And the image that I have in my mind is from the first in the Lord of the Rings series, where Gandalf the wizard is standing there and this evil, creature from the pit of the earth, the Balrog, Is it the
Yeah.
Balrog? There must be,
Balrog.
there've got to be some Lord of the Rings fans in here,
Reminds
sort of
him of
coming
Ryan.
at him, yeah. And he sort of, pounds his staff down and says, "You shall not pass." And, it's just sort of this great moment. I love that. I could watch that a dozen times. But that's kind of what happens when we move into that realm of conscience and belief. We should be able to say to the government, we should be able to say to the state, "You shall not pass. You do not have a place in this space. This is where I am sovereign over my conscience and my beliefs." And yes, we always have to, you have to be reasonable, and that doesn't mean that you can say, "You've got to get me a female doctor at 3 a.m. We understand that, but still at a deep level, we should be able to assert that with that same conviction, if not quite the class of Gandalf in that moment. Another point that I'd like to throw out quickly is the notion that when we, and this is sort of, again, our mission at USERF is to encourage our government to make it a foreign policy priority, to encourage other countries in the world to make religious freedom, the protection of religious freedom, something that they feel obligated to do and that they want to do. And I think it's something that we do because it reflects our values. It's something that we do because, as I said, it implicates our national security and our ability through our foreign policy to deal effectively with other countries. But it is also a way, one might say, of encouraging societies to truly become mature on their own terms and in their own way. If you pause to consider it, there is no better demonstration of the deep underlying maturity of a society than to get to the point where people of different faith confessions and of no faith confessions truly have the ability, safely and on a basis of equality and respect, to occupy the public square. And that will always involve people's feelings being hurt, people being offended, things being said and done that, don't make one group or another happy. And therein lies the maturity. It's one level of maturity to be able to say, "I'm a Democrat," which I am. And, can't stand the right-wing Republicans, but you know what? They have a right to be here too and to say what they want to say. And we're going to go head to head and we're going to have some clashes. And maybe out of those clashes will come a better social policy for our country. It's one thing to be able to say that about politics or what movies you like or what sports teams. I know in Canada that could be touchy, because hockey being a religion, that's a whole different ballgame. But when a society is able to do that on the ground of faith, then you've really sort of arrived. Then you've achieved a real level of maturity, because again, those faith beliefs go to the very essence and core of who we are. And when as a society we can have those in the public square and learn to live with things that challenge us, that make us uncomfortable, that are not the way we see the world, then we really know we've been able to kind of put our big girl and big boy panties on, and we're really functioning like grown-ups, like grown-up societies and mature societies. And finally, I guess I would close by just saying that when we in the United States or in Canada, and when other countries make that fundamental commitment to give wide latitude and real running room to the claims of conscience of its members, we find that the sort of societies that we want to live in are the end result of that. And there's a story I like to tell that I sometimes bring up when I teach my classes in college, because it's sort of, you throw out the pop quiz and everybody thinks they know the answer, but then there's sort of a surprise ending. So I will often ask my students, okay, who here can tell me where the wonderful phrase that we all know, government of the people, by the people, and for the people, comes from? And everybody's head nods, and a dozen hands go up, and everybody says what? The Gettysburg Address, right? Okay, everybody in this room, that's the first thing that popped into your mind. And I say, well, you're right in a short term, but that wonderful phrase has a much older provenance. And then I explained to them that John Wycliffe, who was an English priest and philosopher and theologian and reformer and preacher, undertook in the late 1300s to translate the Bible from the Latin Vulgate into the common vernacular. And this was an extraordinarily controversial and dangerous thing to do at that time. Many others who sought to do similar acts of reform paid with their very lives. He actually was not required to pay with his life, but after Wycliffe died, his bones were dug up, put on trial, convicted of heresy, burned at the stake, and sent down, I think it was the Thames River. So this was not an easy thing to undertake. But the part of the story that I find very moving always is that the words that he wrote on the flyleaf of that first Bible, and what he wrote was the following: "The translation is complete and shall make possible government of the people, by the people, and for the people." Now, I can't know precisely what he meant when he wrote those words, but I do believe that he was illuminating for all of us a profound insight, and that is that when men and women are free to pursue and understand truth for themselves, they become empowered to build societies that honor the claims of conscience and the fundamental liberties and rights of all people. Thank you.
Thank you both for very stimulating presentations. Now, I had complaints from the audience during the break that we cut short the discussion about laïcité because we wanted to avoid difficult questions. So we will reopen the discussion of laïcité too, but Dr. Lantos Swett can stay with us only for another 20 minutes. So the question of religious freedom will now be on the agenda, and then we can return to the problems of laïcité. And please present yourself to our presenters, please.
Hi, so I'm Carla. I'm one of the research fellows. This might come off stronger than I intended to, so apologies in advance, but
We've got our big boy and big girl panties on today, so we're good, right?
So, I'm a little troubled by the language of maturity in your presentation, and the reason why I find it troubling is because it seems reminiscent of patronizing language used during the colonial encounter, and it also troubles me because I think you can't quite talk about religious freedom without also thinking about missionary work in an international context. And I think one of the other aspects that we, and the resident philosopher in the room perhaps has written about this more eloquently than I have, but I think there is a conflict between secularism and religion in the way in which we try to parse out these terms when we're talking about worldviews in general. And I wonder about these foreign policy moments in which ideas about universalism, individualism, democracy all have a very rooted tradition. And when they get, when those kinds of values become universalized in the ways in which perhaps we say the human rights doctrine is an example of, I think becomes a little problematic. And my reaction is to really try to historicize and particularize these moments and to think about being very particular about when we use these universalized language. Because, I mean, even in the human rights doctrine, you have two covenants that emerge, and they're aligned in the Cold War politics. And you have the covenant for civil and political rights, which seems to be the way that you're defining religion, as opposed to, you know, cultural and economic and social rights. And it's a shame that Professor Young is gone, because a Hobby Lobby is it would be an interesting way to bring that back in as well. So I guess those are some of my concerns, and I don't know how to finesse those in better language. So apologies for the heated nature of it.
Well, certainly no apology needed. You know, obviously everything about what we do is informed by history, and history is complicated and messy and embarrassing and shameful and dirty in many, many respects, and so we can't escape that. But what I think it's just a mistake to let ourselves be bound by the sort of mistakes and shames of the past, and therefore finding ourselves unwilling to say things bluntly and with conviction that we believe to be true now. I like, it's not a perfect quote here, but John Adams once said that facts are stubborn things. And I do think that there are certain political facts that we can talk about. And I would absolutely feel quite comfortable defending the notion that I put out there, that the ability for a society to welcome into the public square with protection, respect, and all of the willingness to endure the discomfort that comes from having many, many confessions and no confessions, sharing that public space, is a sign of maturity. And I think it's a sign of dangerous and devastating immaturity for societies that are now unable to do that. And I think of the example of, this was probably now a couple of years ago, when the very awful and distasteful and additionally embarrassingly stupid video about Muhammad came out, that, you know, I don't know if any of you actually saw it. I mean, it was an absolutely pathetic and offensive and hateful and ridiculous piece of garbage. You know, full stop. It had absolutely nothing to commend it. But having said that, of course, what came forth in response to that, the anger and the violence and the you know, the riots and the attacks on embassies and so on and so forth, was shocking and disturbing to people who, in, you know, societies that understand that freedom involves the freedom for people to say sometimes annoying, hurtful, offensive, stupid things, that there is a need for a degree of maturity. And I remember having really intense discussions with fellow commissioners at the time. We were contemplating doing an op-ed on it. And we talked about a wide variety of things. You know, we talked about, for example, because, you know, some said, well, you know, part of the problem is that in the West, because nobody takes their religion terribly seriously, it's very hard for people from a Western mindset to understand how deeply offensive this is to many people in the Muslim world, because they take their faith seriously. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that, that for Westerners who, you know, for many, they, you know, think of religion as a quaint hangover from a more primitive past, and, you know, and they may go through the motions, but lots of people in the West, and certainly lots of people in our foreign service, that's their point of view. And so there was this sense of, you can't understand how offensive this is to people who really take their faith seriously. But, you know, then we had the counter argument, people saying, well, let's take a look at what's going on in the United States right now. What are the awards? The Tonys, you know, were just awarded to a musical which makes huge ridiculing fun and really very offensive fun of the founding prophet of a current important faith community in the United States, the LDS community, with the Book of Mormon, which was a huge hit on Broadway. And, you know, and there you had it, you know, because people said, you know, these are attacks against the founding prophet and so on and so forth, and making sexual allegations. He said, well, you have another faith community, their founding prophet, being just excoriated and humiliated in a wildly popular thing. And, you know, people aren't firebombing the theaters. It gets the Tonys. And, you know, again, that idea of, you know, you pull up your pants and you deal with it. And one of the things that came up in these discussions was, would it be, I mean, we're all upset. Everybody was upset that this garbage was produced. But in a way, a society has to understand that if every time somebody offends you, you will take to the streets and you will attack and you will engage in violence, that is a dead-end street. And, you know, I've heard people say, well, you know, what needs to happen is you need to flood the zone with so much offensive stuff that one day people just wake up and they say, this is garbage. We're not going to let people who are saying nasty things about us run our lives. And then you move on, and then it loses its power. So I do think maturity, I don't back away at all from the word maturity. I think it's important to put it out there that it is part of being a mature society.
I'd like to get to your point about universalism or universalization of particular values or principles. And I might come across sounding more strongly than I mean to, but I think it's very important that we appreciate what is happening in the world today with regards to egregious violations of religious freedom. The Universal Declaration, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, has been subscribed to by a majority of nation states in the world. It is a very slippery slope to relativize truth. And when we speak about these fundamental principles of human dignity, of freedom, and rights come with associated responsibilities. There's not, we know that in our societies that there's no such thing as absolute freedom. There have to be necessary limits as can be justified in a free and democratic society, as the Section 1 of the Canadian Charter states. But we have to be very careful when we come from our perspective as living in a Western liberal democracy, where we have been tremendously fortunate to live in a society where the types of violations of freedoms that take place in much of the world do not happen. When we're advancing religious freedom, sorry? Sorry? Oh, I don't know what, sorry. Okay. There are always going to be challenges, to certain rights being violated, absolutely. We've already had a flavor of that in the discussion today, talking about the domestic side of things. But I think we should not, to cite what Katrina said, we should not shy away from advancing these fundamental principles of human rights, the rule of law, justice, freedom. When you see what's happening in countries such as Saudi Arabia, such as China, such as Pakistan, where people are being brutally tortured, killed, imprisoned, by their own governments in many cases. We should not be naive as to what's happening in the world. And if I can be even more frank, people don't immigrate to Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and China. They come to the United States, to Canada, to Australia, to the UK, to countries that embrace these freedoms and seek to live them out with debate. Are we perfect? No. Do we have warts? Absolutely. Have we had to work through a lot of these difficulties? We talked about that before. Drawing again another connection to McGill. McGill University didn't allow Jewish students until when? 1950?
Well, they had numerous classes,
yeah. Yeah, very, quotas and so forth. So, in our own societies, we've had to go through periods of working out how these freedoms actually are understood and how they can be more expansively understood. So I would caution a relativizing of these types of principles because they're somehow culturally specific. And I'd like to mention the point of missionary activity. In freedom of religion, as we understand freedom of religion, there has to be the freedom to engage in missionary activity, if that's what your faith calls you to, whether you're a Mormon, whether you're a Muslim, different Christian traditions, whatever they might be. Have there been cases through history that we learn from where there has been coercion used to advance religious missionary activities? Yes. There have also been numerous cases where people have freely come to a particular religion of their own exercise of free will. So do we consider the Christianization of England as being a violation of the rights of pagan Anglo-Saxon culture? Do we consider the advance of Islam into parts of North Africa as a violation of that particular culture? We have to be very careful when we look at historical examples and try not to engage in revisionism or a relativizing of certain situations.
And you will be protecting Muslim missionizing in Europe today?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
Of course.
absolutely.
So maybe, I mean, I don't think that the county is calling for it, I just careful to go for the historical. And if you make a historical claim, you try to see the historical situation, that doesn't necessarily justification or recognizing.
Exactly. That was my point, is trying to ensure that we.
To your own example in terms of values, these are important.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Tom, and I agree. That was, I mean, I want to emphasize that we need to learn from history. We gain our experiences from history and how to grow as a human civilization through the experience of history. But I think we need to also recognize that there are, talking about maturity, there are those countries where that process of, I think, maturation towards a greater respect for human dignity has had some significant challenges.
The reason why, for my comment, is we had a conference before that, and an extremely prominent European political scientist, in order to give an indication of what the problem of Muslim integrations in Europe, pointed out the fact of Muslim missionizing as an issue. Mainstream European Academy.
That's surprising.
Interesting.
Okay.
Can I just address something to Katrina, because she has to leave? I would like to ask her to talk briefly about the International Panel for Parliamentary Freedom of Religion or Belief, which you just launched.
Absolutely. Yeah. This was a wonderful initiative that USERF sort of seeded, but we kind of feel like a midwife and the baby's been born, and now we're going to, I think, have to hand it off to more appropriate parents. But for a long time, it was the United States more or less alone, and then Canada joined us in having this notion that there was even a role for protecting international religious freedom as an integrated part of a country's foreign policy. And I absolutely believe that not only are we better when we're together in fighting for fundamental values, but that to the extent the United States is talking about something or Canada is talking about something, it's less effective than when political leadership within these countries themselves are talking about it. So about a year ago, a little over a year ago, there have been stirrings within Europe. So in England, they had formed an all-party parliamentary group on freedom of religion and belief, something similar in the European Parliament. Things have been happening in a variety of ways. So the idea sort of came together as to whether or not we could create an international panel of parliamentarians, each of whom in their own country would want to sort of be sensitive to issues of religious freedom, advocate on its behalf, but then would also have the strength of coming together to do things jointly as a group. So we launched this just 2 weeks ago in Oslo. It was sort of the formal thing. We had a charter that all of them signed. We had parliamentarians from 30 countries, 30 parliamentarians from 20 countries. The sort of heroine of the gathering was a parliamentarian from Pakistan, a woman. And in Pakistan, it's very, very dangerous to advocate for freedom of religion and belief. They had one of their government ministers, Shahbaz Bhatti, was assassinated for speaking out against Pakistan's incredibly draconian blasphemy law, and there are a number of people on death row in Pakistan for violating the blasphemy codes, and many more serving life sentences. So she was sort of the hero of the gathering, because you had people from a wide variety of places, but it was fantastic. It was a number of countries in Europe, Germany, Sweden, Norway, Hungary was there, Spain, Turkey was definitely there, yes, and then we had from South America representatives from Sri Lanka and Malaysia, from Indonesia. So it was very exciting, and the hope would be that this group, individually working through the parliaments of their own countries, will raise the level of awareness of the importance of this issue, but then that they will also come together to jointly sign letters and do other initiatives showing sort of this web of connectedness. So thank you for the opportunity to bring that up, because I had neglected to do so. And I would dearly love to stay, because I have the feeling the conversation is going to get only more interesting, and thank you for your excellent question. But
Thank you for being here.
I'm really glad I could, and
Really appreciate it.
thank you guys for organizing it, and enjoy the rest of the discussion. Okay.
Okay, this is on. So I think I'm following up on
Name?
this question. Sorry. Aaron Roberts, I'm one of the research fellows here. So I think I'm following this question, although I think from a different angle. I'm not particularly bothered about this maturity language, so let's have that clear at first. Although I think it's in the same sort of spirit of things. So human rights it's not about contract law. It has nothing to do with whether or not XYZ country has signed a document. Instead, and I think this has been a common theme, instead it rests upon an image of what a human being is, a bearer of this trait called dignity. This is what human rights are meant to protect. And it's not something, at least if human rights are to be intelligible and to mean anything at all, it's something universal. It's something that is not the peculiar preserve of Western liberal democracies, but belongs to all of them. Yet we're confronted with this uncomfortable fact that two of the largest and most powerful countries in the world, and I'll just name Russia and China, very vehemently disagree. And if the New York Times is to be believed, they actually sincerely believe this language to be a subtle form of Western imperialism. And it's not difficult for me to imagine similar types of conferences like this one taking place in Russia or in China, organized around that theme. I don't know if it has taken place, but it's not hard to imagine.
Certainly in Russia, yeah.
So that's an uncomfortable truth. So this raises a couple of questions, which hopefully you can address. So how do we, as observers, think about this situation? A couple options come to mind. We can think of it as these other parties, that they've made some sort of intellectual error. That's one possibility. Or perhaps they're evil, that this is the manifestation of evil in the world. That's another possibility. More provocatively, we could describe it as heresy from the International Creed. Or maybe there's some other explanation that I'm not thinking of. Immaturity. So how are we to think about this? And then the follow-up question is, those of us who are committed to it, to this idea, to this code, to this creed, what are we to do about it, as at least from the diplomatic level, from the level of statesmen? Do we coerce these countries? Because if we do that, it raises, again, the question of Western imperialism. Do we bribe them? Do we offer them aid packages? So a form of bribery. Do we talk to them at great length, hoping that we'll convince them? I myself am skeptical that that will have any effect. Or do we just ignore it? Or is there some other option that I'm not thinking of? And so those were my two questions.
Very good questions. And I agree with you as you sort of preamble how you frame things around human rights. And let me just reiterate that I don't think, as you yourself put, and I think I tried to reflect in my comments, we can't see human rights as purely defined by the Universal Declaration. But when countries sign on to these universal agreements, I think we can point to those saying, do you believe what you signed on to? Do you adhere to this understanding that is understood, in the world to be a universal declaration? So how do we think about China and Russia, or the examples you brought up? The perspectives that China and Russia have on religious freedom, yes, are very contrary in many respects to what we have here in the United States or in Canada or other like-minded countries. I don't think we can define it as heresy. I don't think we can talk about it as being immaturity either, nor do I think we can get into questions about evil, because then we're getting into more theological issues, and I can go there, but I don't want to go there in this forum. In the case of China, well, let me say this. All of the countries that we look at through our work in our office, and we look at between 15 and 17 countries where there are really grave violations of religious freedom going on, each country has to be treated sui generis. I mean, you're talking about very complex political cultures, different forms of institutional frameworks, a whole range of different things. So we can't approach it in a naive way. Obviously we have to see what is happening on the ground, given certain contexts. But if we use, again, human dignity and upholding human dignity as the foundation for our work, then when we look at what's happening in China, whether it is through government restrictions on religious freedom that leads to the imprisoning of bishops, leads to acts of Tibetan Buddhists to self-immolate themselves, which is a gross violation of Buddhist principles, whether it's the tearing down of crosses on churches that have gotten a little too big in Wenzhou and violate building codes, supposedly. We need to, I think, be able to speak out and state that we believe these things, these actions to be wrong. Now, in terms of foreign policy, obviously we have a very complex bilateral relationship with most countries, including the United States. So we can speak and condemn certain actions that certain countries take, while at the same time, engaging in a whole range of other foreign policy priorities. Prime Minister Harper was just recently in China, where he engaged the Chinese on commercial business, on trade, and so forth, but he also regularly raised the question of violations of religious freedom. So I really believe that we can have a dialogue. Is that dialogue going to change things overnight? I don't think so. But there are a lot of other things that come to play as to whether there will be a shift. In the case of China, we're seeing the exponential growth in religious practice, and that's been happening over the last number of decades, not only amongst growth in Christian groups, but also amongst those Chinese that practice different forms of Buddhism, Han Chinese that have embraced Islam, Han Chinese that have actually embraced Tibetan Buddhism. And we're seeing this growth take place, and increasingly I think the Chinese have realized that the kind of command and control administrative structure that they have through the State Agency for Religious Affairs is no longer functioning very well. And they themselves are looking for new ways of addressing the presence of religion in society and coming to understand, okay, how can religion be of benefit to the whole? Because in China, the idea of the whole is very important. In the case of Russia, you're seeing a refashioning of Russian identity since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The embracing of a very interesting sort of syncretist Russian identity that draws very heavily upon 19th century ideas of the Slavic world, or Ruski Mir, the Russian world, in which orthodoxy is a defining element. And Ruski Mir includes Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. So the actions that Russia is taking in Ukraine right now, which is ostensibly a geopolitical conflict involving the EU, NATO, other allies with Russia over Ukraine, Russia has been trying to instrumentalize religion to turn that into a religious conflict, that this is about the canonical territory of the Russian Orthodox Church, and that these schismatics, uniates, Crimean Tatars, are outside of this understanding of the Russian world. And so we obviously have to take actions against them, as we're seeing in Crimea and also in the eastern part of Ukraine. So again, I think dialogue is important. The countries that we engage kind of run across a spectrum. We cannot have a dialogue with Iran at present. But those countries that we have engaged in a dialogue with, including a country like Pakistan that has very severe challenges, they're willing to have a dialogue with us, to talk with us, recognizing that they've got these challenges. Now, where we are now in that dialogue and where we'll be in 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, I think is the measure of engagement. So I really think that we don't coerce, we don't bribe, we don't approach things in a way that is naming and shaming all the time. I think at times you do need to name and shame. In the case of Iran, in the case of Saudi Arabia, other countries that are persecuting people horribly. But dialogue always goes much further, even if that dialogue has to be a century long. Hopefully there will be some change.
Why are you reticent in full-time dialogue with Iran?
Well, we're not reticent about having dialogue with Iran. It's just we're not reticent in having dialogue with Iran. It's just very difficult at this point in time. So we engage Iran in various ways. We don't engage the regime in an open dialogue because, first of all, we don't have diplomatic relations with Iran at the present time. But we do engage Iran in a variety of different ways through diaspora groups. We speak out against those groups in Iran that are being targeted, including dissident Shia who refuse to accept the Khomeini understanding of the fusion of Islam with the state, which is very different from the Shia understanding of the al-Houthi or al-Sistani school you find in Iraq. So how do we can engage and make statements and do a lot of different types of take different diplomatic actions to raise awareness about what's happening to all the different groups facing persecution in Iran. But we also recognize that we're dealing with a very difficult, and that's putting it mildly, regime that is only increasing religious persecution despite this kind of facade of engaging the world on the nuclear issue. If you look at what's been happening under President Rouhani, there's been an increasing persecution of Baha'is, of Christians. We've also been seeing increasing persecution of young women who don't conform to the moralist sort of ideas of the regime.
As disclosure, this is speaking as a Pakistani. The
Yep.
religious climate in Pakistan is exponentially worse. If you express your willingness to engage with Pakistan.
Sure.
I don't understand the rationale behind that policy.
Well, first of all, Pakistan, unlike Iran, is attempting to grow and shift and to try and reform its institutions, try to increase its rule of law. The Iranians are not interested in engaging in many of those areas. Also, the Pakistani state is not increasing its number of executions each year by dozens. The Pakistani government is also not engaging directly in the mass persecution of Baha'is. Now, you can say that Ahmadiyya Muslims in Pakistan have absolutely no standing because of the what exists in the Pakistani criminal code. I mean, Ahmadiyya have no status officially in the country. So, but when we speak to the Pakistani government, we raise these issues on a regular basis, and there's a dialogue that takes place. That dialogue right now is not possible with Iran. Does Pakistan have lots of problems? Yes. They'd be the first to recognize this. It's not possible with Iran, the Iranian government, I mean, the regime. We can't have that. We can't have that dialogue at present with the Iranian regime. We can have that dialogue at present with Pakistan and with many different levels of Pakistani society, including different faith communities. I know you're very skeptical about this, but having spent time in Pakistan and engaged with a variety of different levels of government, with a variety of different faith communities, NGOs that are allowed to act within Pakistan in the area of religious freedom. In Pakistan, we're able to actually launch projects to address some of the root causes of religious persecution, and that is happening. That does not happen in Iran.